They heard knocks at night, found messages in red, and thought it was a ghost. But the truth was far worse. Someone had been living inside their walls, watching them. Viewer discretion is advised. You're listening to Pale Walks. 15-year-old Annie Bowen and her youngest sister Jessica lived in the small town of Pepperell, Massachusetts. In the early fall of 1986, the sisters suffered a devastating loss. Their mother, Deborah, had passed away from illness. She had grown visibly weaker day by day, and although their family had tried to prepare for the worst, no one is ever truly ready. They were very close to their mother, and it was especially hard for Annie to accept her passing. To cope with the grief, she continued talking to her mother as if she was still there. At night, like a prayer, she whispered the same words. That she missed her, would never forget her, and knew her mother could hear her. Their father, Frank Bowen, tried to support his daughters as best he could. After his wife's death, he took on even more work, now being the family's sole provider. He often worked night shifts. Weeks passed. Only a couple of months had gone by since Deborah's passing, but Annie's thoughts remained consumed by her mother. One day, while Frank was at work, Annie suggested to Jessica that they try to contact their mother through a spirit summoning session. Annie likely got the idea from a horror movie. The girls went down to the basement, lit some candles, and sat across from each other. Annie began repeating the same words, asking their mother to give them a sign. They sat in a dimly lit room, surrounded by boxes, random clutter, and flickering candles that pushed back the shadows. Nothing unusual happened during the session itself. The strangeness began afterward. Once the mystical setup was cleaned up and the girls returned to their bedroom, Annie was upset that their attempt to connect had failed. Late that night, they heard a strange knocking sound. The house was old and prone to random creaks under its own weight, but this noise was rhythmic, something they had never heard before. It could have been a coincidence. The girls became convinced they had managed to summon the spirit of their mother. They began asking questions aloud, and in response, the unseen presence would knock on the walls, tapping, rustling, banging on the pipes. Sounds they had never heard before were now happening every night when Frank was at work. Small belongings started to go missing. The furniture would be moved. Lights would turn off on their own. The doorbell would ring, loud and persistent, but no one would be at the door. It was hard to adjust to such paranormal activity. Annie and Jessie could barely sleep. They began asking the spirit to leave, but slowly the girls started to believe that what had entered their home wasn't the friendly ghost of their mother. They had invited in something else, something malicious, and the situation kept getting worse. Frightened, the girls told their father about the supernatural events, but he didn't believe them. He chalked it up their way of coping with grief, or a cry for attention. After all, none of these things happened while he was at home. Then, on a dark and chilly evening in late autumn 1986, while Annie and Jessie were doing homework in the living room, the knocking started again. By now, these strange sounds and unexplained happenings had become a regular part of their lives. The girls had almost grown used to them and tried not to react. But this time, the knocking got louder, and it was coming from the basement for the first time. Just like in a typical horror movie, Annie and Jessie decided to investigate. Annie armed herself with a large kitchen knife, and together they went toward the sound. Down in the basement, they found something chilling. Written in blood red letters on the wall was the message, "I am in your room, come and find me." Screaming, the girls ran from basement and bolted out of the house. They fled to a neighbor's home. The neighbor kept them safe until their father, Frank, returned home. Annie and Jessie told Frank everything, especially about the disturbing message. Frank called the police. When officers arrived, they checked the basement and the rest of the house. It was empty. The message on the wall, they concluded, was just ketchup. This only convinced Frank further that the entire thing was a hoax, a performance staged by his daughters to get his attention and stop him from working so much. After losing their mother, the girls clearly missed his presence at home. Frank did what he could. He started spending more time with them, making sure they felt supported. He even arranged for both girls to see a therapist. Finally, for a while, things calmed down. The strange occurrences stopped. In December 1986, the girls were watching a movie together in the living room. Their father was out again on a night shift. Suddenly, there was a knock. Faint, hesitant. Annie asked Jessie to mute the TV. The mysterious sound was coming from upstairs, from the bedroom. As the girls went to investigate, they found a new message scrawled in red on the wall. "I'm back. Find me." Terrified, they ran to the neighbor's house once again. From there, they called their father and begged him to come home immediately. Frank had had enough. He decided to put an end to Annie and Jessie's antics, once and for all. He went into the house alone, despite the girls pleading with him not to. They waited with the neighbor. Frank opened the front door. The TV was on at full volume. Annie and Jessie insisted they hadn't touched it. Frank walked into the living room and turned it off, only to hear another TV blaring from a different room. The sound was coming from Annie's bedroom. Slowly, he walked towards it. Inside, on the large mirror, was another message. "Marry me." As he stood staring at the words, Frank didn't immediately notice the figure standing in the dark corner of the room. Blonde hair, a white wedding dress, the same kind his late wife used to wear. For a split second, Frank thought that he was seeing his deceased wife. And then the figure stepped out of the shadows. It wasn't a ghost. It was a young man, short in stature, wearing a wig, a woman's dress, and heavy makeup. In his hand, he was holding an axe. The stranger began moving toward Frank, raising their weapon. Frank bolted out of the room. Once outside, he told his daughters and the neighbor only one thing: "We need to go. Now." At last, Frank realized that what the girls had been saying wasn't made up. Something or someone had really been in their house. They ran back to the neighbor's home and Frank called the police. The police arrived quickly. Some officers searched the house while others questioned Frank and his daughters. Frank told them he had never seen the intruder before. The house seemed empty. The intruder had apparently escaped. Still, officers thoroughly checked every room and the beds inside closets. Eventually, one of them noticed that the wardrobe didn't sit flush against the wall. Behind it, there was a gap and a narrow seam in the wall itself. When the officer moved the wardrobe aside, he found a hidden panel, a small concealed door. Behind, it was a crawl space. Inside, crouched in the darkness, was a teenage boy. It was a 16-year-old Daniel Laplante, a local boy. Daniel had been secretly living inside the walls of the Bowens' home. The small crawl space behind the wardrobe led into a network of hidden tunnels that allowed him to move around the house completely undetected. In those cramped corridors, officers found candy wrappers, fast food containers, empty beer cans, and a sleeping bag. Daniel had even carved tiny holes in the walls to watch the girls from inside. It became clear that Daniel had been pretending to be the ghost of Annie and Jessica's mother, making noises in the walls, moving objects, and scaring the girls, likely because he thought it was funny. But why did he choose the Bowens sisters? Why Annie specifically? Because Annie knew him. There was a brief connection between them. Sometime earlier, the phone had rung in the Bowens' house. Annie picked up and heard an unfamiliar voice. It was Daniel. He introduced himself by name, but everything else he said was a lie. He told Annie he was from nearby school, that he was an athlete, played football, and was quite popular. He claimed he had seen her somewhere and liked her immediately. He found her number, he said, through mutual friends. Annie was intrigued. They talked on the phone for a few evenings. Eventually, Daniel asked her out, but when Annie opened the door and saw him standing there, she was shocked. He looked nothing like the high school football player she imagined. Still, out of politeness, she agreed to go for a walk. They had ice cream and talked for a while. During the walk, Annie opened up. She talked about her mother's passing and even mentioned wanting to try a spiritual session to contact her. Despite how vulnerable she'd been, Annie didn't want to see Daniel again. She stopped answering his calls. Occasionally, Jessica would pick up and say Annie wasn't home. Was Daniel doing all of this out of revenge? Or was he just using what he knew to torment the girls for amusement? Possibly both. At the time, Police didn't consider him a serious threat to the girls' lives. Even when he stood in Annie's room holding an axe, they believed he only wanted to scare them, then hide again in the walls. After the first police visit, Daniel had gone quiet for a while, frightened, but he eventually resumed his games. This time, though, they caught him. Daniel LaPlante was born in 1970 in Townsend, Massachusetts, just 7 miles away from Pepperell, the hometown of the Bowens family. He had a traumatic childhood, although little is known about the exact details of his upbringing. It's reported that Daniel was subjected to both emotional and inappropriate treatment by his father. During high school years, he had no friends. Most of his classmates at North Middlesex High School described him as creepy or strange. To make matters worse, Daniel was diagnosed with dyslexia in elementary school, a condition that made reading and writing extremely difficult. He would confuse letters, switch syllables, and struggle to keep up. This only made him a bigger target for ridicule. By the time he was 12 or 13, Daniel had begun breaking into homes. Almost every night he would sneak into houses and steal valuables. His burglary skills improved quickly. He became so good at it that he could steal from homes even while the owners were still inside. By age of 15, Daniel was not just taking things, he began leaving objects behind or moving them in subtle ways so that the homeowners would feel like something was wrong, but couldn't quite figure out what. He enjoyed playing mind games with them. And with the Bowen family, Daniel had all the information he needed, thanks to that first phone call and their brief connection. But after his arrest, things became even more disturbing. After being discovered inside the walls of the Bowens home, Daniel underwent a psychiatric evaluation and was placed in a facility for juvenile offenders. Despite his history, the Bowen family, wanting a fresh start, decided to move. They relocated to New Hampshire, hoping to leave everything behind. It turned out to be the right decision. Daniel, as would later become clear, was far more dangerous than anyone had realized, and could have easily returned to the Bowens home with far worse intentions. Daniel remained in juvenile detention until October 1987, but then the court decided he would be tried as an adult. His mother paid a $10,000 bail, and Daniel was released to live with her and his stepfather. Almost immediately after his release, he returned to burglaries, but now it wasn't just about stealing. He did it to feel a sense of control, a kind of power he didn't feel in any other part of his life. During one of his break-ins in November of that year, Daniel stole 2 handguns. And then, in December 1987, everything escalated. Daniel broke into the Gustafson family home. While he was inside, 33-year-old Priscilla Gustafson, who was pregnant, arrived home with her 2 young children, 8-year-old Abigail and 5-year-old William. Her husband, Andrew Gustafson, was still at work. When Andrew returned late that day, he walked into a scene of unimaginable horror. He found Priscilla face down on the bed with blood-soaked pillows around her. She had been assaulted and then fatally shot multiple times at close range. Andrew immediately called the police. Officers later discovered the bodies of the children in separate bathrooms. 5-year-old William had been drowned in the upstairs bathtub. 8-year-old Abigail had met the same fate downstairs. The police immediately decided to visit Daniel LaPlante, who lived not far from the Gustafsons, to either eliminate him as a suspect or confirm their suspicions. Only a dense stretch of woods about a mile wide separated Daniel's house from the Gustafsons' residence. There were no other homes in between. When police arrived, Daniel was nowhere to be found. Given the gruesome nature of the crime and the disturbing similarities of the Bowens case, authorities launched a massive manhunt. Daniel was declared extremely dangerous and his photo was broadcast widely through television and other media. Hundreds of law enforcement personnel joined the search. Frank Bowen learned about the Gustafsons case from the news. But he didn't tell his daughters. They had already gone through enough. He simply asked them to stay indoors and made sure he stayed home with them. Even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly safe. After nearly 48 hours of searching, a tip came in. A man reported seeing someone matching Daniel's description near a lumberyard warehouse, roughly 12 miles from Townsend. Police surrounded the building. Helicopters circled overhead to ensure no one could escape undetected. Eventually, they found Daniel hiding inside a trash bin at the warehouse. Forensic testing later found a strand of Abigail's hair on his sock. On his clothing, investigators detected traces of Priscilla's blood. It was undeniable. Daniel LaPlante was responsible for what happened to the Gustafsons family. A year later, he was sentenced to 3 life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. However, the state's Supreme Court later ruled that juveniles could not be sentenced to life without parole. Because of this, Daniel LaPlante will be eligible for parole after serving 45 years in the year 2032. In 2017, when Daniel LaPlante was 47 years old, he was formally diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, a condition marked by a lack of empathy and disregard for others. People with this disorder often see those around them not as individuals, but merely as tools to satisfy their own dark desires. Thanks for watching. If this case resonated with you, consider subscribing, turning on notifications, and letting me know what do you think about this case in the comments. And what's more important, stay vigilant. Until next time.